Let's learn the Texas Instruments 30x calculator. I've noticed several students knew the material, they studied hard, and when they went to take the test, they got several questions wrong because they were using the calculator wrong. So I want to go over some basic stuff so that you're able to use the calculator properly and get a passing score. First thing is parentheses. I've noticed that several times just in how things are typed in. If parentheses aren't used, you'll get an incorrect answer. So let's say, for instance, you're dividing 3 by 2 plus 6. So if you type that in just as it appears there, you would type in 3, the division sign, 2 plus 6. Now the way the calculator will handle that is it'll take 3 and divide it by 2, which is 1.5, and then it'll add 6 to that, which will give you 7.5. That's not the right answer. Obviously, this is equals 3 divided by 8, which is 0.375. So we're getting the wrong answer by typing things in wrong. So parentheses are a way of telling the calculator to do that particular operation first. So what you want to do is type it in as 3, the divide by sign, a parenthesis, then 2 plus 6, and then a closing parenthesis. That tells it that what's in parentheses has to be done first. So you want to make sure that you're including that. Anytime, especially when you're doing division, put the parentheses in. It helps make sure that the calculation gets done right. Your parentheses are right here, these two keys. Use them when you need to. Now, the thing about this calculator, it can get very complicated when you're typing in long expressions. I know that in one instance, let me grab a new sheet of paper. If you have two capacitors that are in parallel, in order to find an equivalent capacitance by combining those two together, your equivalent capacitance equals 1 over 1 divided by the first capacitor value plus 1 over the second capacitor value. So when you're typing in all this, it can start getting complicated. Let's say that capacitor 1 is 2 farads and capacitor 2 is 4 farads. So when I type this into the calculator, it becomes 1 divided by parentheses, 1 divided by 2, parentheses, plus parentheses, 1 divided by 4, parentheses. If you miss any of those parentheses, things might go goofy on you. So it's a lot to type all that in. Probably more complicated than it needs to be. What you might want to do is solve for these individual things first. Just take 1 over 2, which is 0.5, and then take 1 over 4, which is 0.25, and just rewrite the equation so that it's a little bit more simple to deal with. This is a little easier to type into the calculator. You know, it'll be 1 divided by parentheses 0.5 plus 0.25 parentheses. You'll get the right answer. So trying to type in a long amount of equations with lots of different parentheses, you can make a mistake somewhere. You might want to simplify things and break it down so that the whole calculation goes more simple. Another handy feature on the calculator is that you can use a previous answer in the next calculation. So let's say you were doing 3 divided by 8. Turn it on, type in 3 divided by 8 equals, and you get your answer. Now, what if you wanted to add 5 to that? You can actually just hit the plus key, and notice it puts the word answer there, plus, and then you can type in another value, 5, and hit equals. And so it used the previous answer to work on another equation to give you another answer. So use that answer function whenever you have to. It's a quick and easy way to not have to type in numbers more than once. All right, let's go over some of the basic functions of the calculator. If you were going to do 3 squared, there's a squared button. First you type in 3, and your squared button has this little x with a 2 above it. That's x squared. Hit that button, hit equals, it gives you your answer as 9. But what if you want to go 3 to the 9th power? For that, you have to use this little caret button. This little upward facing arrow is called a caret. It just means raising it to a power. So we type in 3, this little caret button, it puts it in there. Type in 9, hit enter, and there's your answer for taking 3 to the 9th power. If you want to do square root, you could do the square root of 5. To do that, you would type in, you would use this x squared button, but you'd use the second function first, then the x squared button, and it puts up a square root with a parenthesis in there. And I can type in 5. You can close the parenthesis if you want, but you don't have to. Hit equals, and it gives you your answer. The next thing is to invert a number. Let's say you have 1 over 5. You could type it in as 1 divided by 5 and end up with the answer of 0.2. But sometimes it's easier to use an inverting button, which is this button, x to the minus 1. And that's because 1 over x equals x to the minus 1 power. So if I wanted to know the inverse of 5, I would type in 5, this x to the minus 1 button, enter, and it will give me my 0.2. So that's a fast way to do it. And it comes in handy when you're doing other equations, like let's say you had to take 3 plus 5 equals, and then you wanted to invert that number. You can just hit the x to the minus 1 button, hit equals, and you'll get your number. So it's a fast way to invert something rather than having to type in 1 divided by and the number that you got. It's just faster. Another handy thing to know is exponents. In scientific notation, let's say you have the number 4.2 times 10 to the negative 6. How do you type that into the calculator if they give you this? You can use the key that has x to the minus 1 on it. Its secondary function has an EE above it. So you will end up typing it in as 4.2, and it'll have an E when you press that, and then you'll type in negative 6. So let's go through that. 4.2, and then I hit the second function, and then this x to the minus 1 button gives me that little E there. Then I have to type in negative 6. You don't want to use the negative button here for subtraction. That'll get you the wrong answer. You want to use this little button down here that has a minus sign in parentheses. So you press that, and it puts in a minus sign, and then you type in 6 and hit enter. And now it'll show you that number in regular floating point notation. So that's how you can type that in. Notice it did a little trick there. It shows it in floating point, and sometimes people have difficulty in converting different units. Like if you wanted to know, if you have 42 milliamps and you want to convert that to amps, if you know that milli is 1 times 10 to the negative 3, and micro is 1 times 10 to the negative 6, and so on. You could type things in like that. So I could type in clear this out. I'll type in 42, hit the E function, minus 3 equals, and now that'll show me in decimal form, in floating point form, what 42 milliamps looks like when you write it out. Because oftentimes you have to put the base unit into the formula to do a calculation. If you know what each one of your units equals in 10 times factors, you can type it in that way and it'll show you and convert it into the base unit. So that's handy. Now, one thing I do want to mention is that your calculators can be set to different ways of displaying numbers. Right now it's displaying it in floating point notation, and actually you can change that by hitting the second function in this DRG button. If I do that, notice it brings up FLO underlined, and then there's scientific, and then there's engineering. If you click the side arrow and put it to engineering and hit enter, it's going to display your numbers differently. If you see your numbers being displayed in scientific notation with exponents on it and you're confused by that, hit your second function and then this DRG button, and it'll bring up your options. You'll want to be in floating point notation, hit enter, and numbers will show back up in floating point form. Now let's go into finding angles. This often confuses students. Grab a new sheet here. So it's not very difficult to find the, say, the cosine of 42 degrees. You type it in as cosine and you have your sine, cosine, and tangent here. You can type in cosine 42, hit enter, and it gives you your number equals 0.743 and so on. That's pretty straightforward. But let's say you were doing some trig and they don't know the angle here, but you know that it gives you the adjacent side to that angle is 5 and the hypotenuse near that angle is 8. So you know that cosine of some angle equals 5 divided by 8, because cosine of an angle is the adjacent over the hypotenuse. So we can type that in, 5 divided by 8, and that gives you 0.625. So now I know that the cosine of some angle equals 0.625. So now how do I find that angle? It's not too difficult. What you need to do is use this answer, and you take the cosine to the -1 of that answer. That will give you your theta. So how do I type that in? The alternate second function of your cosine button, if you press second and cosine, it puts in this cosine to the -1. So now I can type in my value, 0.625, hit enter, and it tells me that my angle, theta, is 51.3 degrees. So now I was able to find that angle knowing the adjacent and hypotenuse of that triangle. Now, if your numbers start coming out strange, and I've seen this happen with students, you might have your calculator set to radians. If you look in the lower corner here, you'll see DEG. That stands for degrees. But if I press this secondary function, or actually this button here, DRG, if I press that, notice it brings up degrees, radians, and gradians. Degrees is underlined. If I use the right arrow and put it into radians, hit enter, it's going to give me very different answers for something. So if I typed in the cosine of 51.3, I should have gotten 0.625. I got something very different. And it's because here you can see that I'm in radians mode. It says RAD on the bottom right-hand side of the calculator. So what you want to do is go back to the DRG button, press that, go back into degrees, hit enter, and now you're good to go. So now if I type in the cosine of 51.3 degrees, I get my 0.625 like I started out with. It's very important. It's hard to catch when that happens when you're doing it, because it's giving you an answer. It looks like it might be right, but if you somehow hit that DRG button, keep an eye on what you have on your screen, whether it says degrees or radians, because it'll really affect your answers. The final thing I can offer is more of a strategy on how to solve problems. When you're given a problem, and we'll start out clean here, write down everything that they tell you. If they say that your resistor value is 20, write down 20. If it says that the inductive reactance, X sub L, is 50, write that down. And then it'll usually ask you for what it wants, and if it says impedance, Z, write that down. All right, this is what I don't know, this is what I do know. Oftentimes then you just have to search for a formula that solves for what you don't know and has the other components in it that you already do know. And then, so let's say it's Z equals 1 over the square root of 1 over R squared plus 1 over X sub L squared. These calculations can get pretty difficult, and like I explained before, rewriting the equation, again, with those numbers put into it. I usually write down the equation in its basic form first, then write it down with these numbers in it. If they gave you 20 for R, you put that in. If they gave you 54 X sub L, write that in. And now you can see the equation in front of you. It's I see people, they just want to pick up the calculator and start typing in numbers. It's too easy to lose track of where you're at, which calculations you've done. It's a lot easier to write the equation down, write it down with the values that you were given, and then break it down further and further until you get your answer. If you're not writing these things down, it's easy to accidentally miss something or wander off track. It's just so much better. If you're going to go to the trouble of solving the problem, write it down, every one of your steps. Because also, if you get stuck and you have to ask an instructor, the instructor will be able to see all the steps that you did, and we'll be able to find out where the problem is a lot more quickly. Always ask your instructor. If you ever have a question on anything, that's what they're there for. Ask them, show them your work. More than happy to help you out in figuring these things out. So, and if you have any questions on your calculator that are beyond what's been explained, again, ask your instructor. We're more than happy to point it out to you. I hope that helps. Good luck.